Hello everyone and welcome to the 7th Digital Debate brought to you monthly by the International Civil Society Centre. I'm Vicky Tung, Head of Futures and Innovation here at the Centre and the moderator for this particular event. Our Digital Debate series explores civil society perspectives on the emerging digital world. Each discussion is a call to action for civil society organisations to take a more active role in shaping our digital futures. Today's debate will put the spotlight on cybersecurity, asking whether this is a blind spot for civil society actors on the internet. Here at the Centre, we've recently been talking about cybersecurity with CEOs from our sector, and I've really been struck by the sheer extent to which cyber attacks are actually happening, the sophistication of the attackers and their methods, the levels of vulnerability in many organisations, and the extensive and damaging impacts they can have. These huge potential risks for organisational reputation, business continuity, and the ramifications for staff members mean that attacks are also incredibly sensitive and challenging to talk about openly. So they are happening widely, but not discussed that widely. And there may also be avenues of support and solidarity which organisations equally don't know about. So these are some of the dynamics and potential blind spots which we'll explore with our three great panellists today. So joining us today, I'm delighted to welcome Suha Mohammed, the Strategy and Partnerships Lead at Apti Institute, who's currently joining us from Bangalore in India. Adrian Auger, Chief Operations Officer of the Cyber Peace Institute, who's based in Geneva, Switzerland, and Anthony Wadlow, Controller of Governance and Assurance for Sightsavers, who is based near London in the UK. So welcome to you all. Shortly, I'd like to invite individual inputs from each of you on our topic, and then we'll move into some discussion and questions. But first, I'd like to open by asking each of you to very quickly define what you include in the spectrum of cybersecurity and cyber attacks in your work. So Suha, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here today. Very broadly, I think we view cybersecurity as one among many of the other issues we look at, and we look at it within sort of a rights-based framework. So how we look at the security and privacy of data and information, and of course, the technical infrastructure that underlies it, but also how this extends to the rights of people of which this sort of data reflects realities and experiences and opportunities for. So looking at how those sort of two intersect around rights and privacy as well. And I think the way that we go about enabling or thinking about interventions around cybersecurity have to then be also multidimensional. And then the way they are focusing on, not just creating technical safeguards, but also looking at legal and policy measures, as well as how we can look at the socioeconomic dynamics of, data rights, as well as awareness of these rights, things like literacy around, what we can do as individuals and have greater sort of power in the data economy. So from the perspective of APTI, we look at cybersecurity as a broader theme and sort of a indication of a larger systemic issue that's at play in the data economy, and happy to jump into that a little bit further as we go along.
Thanks, Suha. And Adrian, please, your thoughts on this.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Look, for us, cybersecurity, put simply, is security in cyberspace, right? But we, like Suha, we look at it in a broader sense. And from the Cyber Peace Institute, we also look at the connection with cyber peace. So cybersecurity, my explanation would be that it's really a state in which cyberspace needs to be. It's a state for citizens and digital citizens to enjoy cyberspace, right? So if you look at perhaps cyber defense as being all the measures necessary to achieve that state of cybersecurity, cyber peace would be the step after, where we actually define it as the Cyber Peace Institute as existing when security, equity, and dignity are ensured in digital ecosystem. So it goes really beyond just the technical sense of the term. And so if you extrapolate that to also the cyber attacks, it's basically for us any harm that is being done to cyber peace. So it may be, of course, the technical attacks that we regularly hear about in the news, but it may also be passive or active, deliberate or not deliberate acts to harm cyberspace through inadequate laws, through shutdowns, through repression, through espionage, and things like this. So that's, in a nutshell, how we view the topic. Thank you.
Thanks, Adrian. And Anthony, please.
Hi, thank you. So cybersecurity, for me, it's kind of the sharp and very visible edge of a much wider topic, which is information security. So the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data and systems. So you can see cybersecurity as kind of a rapidly evolving envelope around this much older topic, which is information security. But in practice, we're seeing that it's really a blurred line between the kind of existing control frameworks of an organization, which have changed through the pandemic and are now predominantly digital, and the historic kind of like technical hard edge cybersecurity, which is very technically focused. So it's becoming a very broad topic that's straying into information security and raising all these up in profile. And we're going to find that it's a topic that encroaches on much more of our work and how we do things as organizations.
Great, thanks guys for that context. I think it's really useful as we move into your individual thoughts. So Suha, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think before jumping into sort of thoughts in general on the prompt, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the work we do at APTI. We're a public research organization based in India, and we look at the intersection of technology and society. And within that, we focus on how individuals navigate with, bargain with, and often just access technology. And I think one of the things that we think about cybersecurity is that it fits within a larger context of sort of what I mentioned before as I defined it, this idea that there are sort of real inequities in the data economy and a lack of transparency and accountability most of us as individuals have in being able to know sort of what data is collected on us, how and who it's shared with. And I think this sort of manifests itself in the way that we see it most directly and in most sort of in a high impact way in the way that we see data breaches, et cetera. And I think in context of civil society in particular, we see, this manifests very in ways that can be really malicious and really egregious, particularly because civil society organizations are collecting such vulnerable data and sensitive data that belongs to often very marginalized communities. So the repercussions of these attacks can, relate from physical injury and harm to, the denial of consequential services to, an impact on livelihood, et cetera. And I think just responding to the broader prompt of civil society and whether it is truly a blind spot in cybersecurity, I think the context of whether civil society has to address all of these concerns on their own is one that we have to contend with, questions of capability and questions of awareness of what data ethics could look like in context of these organizations. I think particularly in the Indian context, when we look at emerging regulations around data, there is a large focus on what nonprofits have to do for communities to be able to access rights, but also to make data readily available. So I think increasingly this is something we're contending with in the Indian context. And I think the way that we see it is how can civil society play an ally to, providing a greater avenue for, whether it is maintaining the cybersecurity of the organization or empowering the individuals or the beneficiaries of these larger companies to be able to access their rights, be entitled to have digital rights, et cetera. So I think, very concretely, I think over the course of this debate, what I'd be interested in exploring is sort of 3 different dimensions of cybersecurity that relate to the work we do as well. So how we look at an individual level, how to empower individuals and communities to have sort of greater agency and transparency over their data, to make these decisions and sort of minimize the possibility of these risks or vulnerabilities emerging. At an organizational level, so how civil society, like I said, can play the role of a guardian or an ally in this context and help maintain this sort of level of institutional resilience. So whether that is informing governance protocols or implementing technical safeguards, what is the foundation of resilience that needs to be built in to also make sure that data is not extracted, from beneficiary communities as well. And I think lastly, the last dimension to focus on, around cybersecurity questions, especially with respect to civil society, is how we can build, capacity and capabilities at an ecosystem level, right? So I think a lot of organizations and nonprofits, specifically in the global South, really struggle with or are very nascent in their stage of digital transformation or, digitization in general. So how do we start thinking about really simple ways in which to have these conversations, not only at an organizational level to protect staff, but also, like I said, with beneficiaries, And so I think the last thing that I'll really quickly say is that as we talk about cybersecurity, I think we have to expand the conversation a little bit to look at sort of digital rights more broadly, and then how to embed concepts or principles of data ethics in a way that isn't really paternalistic, but that really encourages participation and collaboration in the way that these processes or protocols are shaped. And then I'll leave it at that, and excited to sort of explore these emerging themes as we go along.
Great, thanks very much, Suha. Adrian, please share your thoughts.
So I'm Adrian. I'm you mentioned CEO of the Cyber Peace Institute, and I'll start by telling you a little bit of a story. A bit more than a year ago, we received an email from an NGO called Roots of Peace that is based in the US, but helping Afghan farmers transform minefields into vineyards. And they were, in essence, telling us that they had been hacked and that they had lost over $1 million in USAID funding. We've been working with them ever since, trying to retrieve those funds. And it's been a very interesting case for us. Basically, what happened was they were, as a small NGO, not used to having very advanced cybersecurity controls. And so they had been reusing a couple of passwords, and attackers were able to extract those passwords from a data leak, and were then able to impersonate the CFO and other wires being sent out of their bank accounts. So that totaled to over $1 million. And it's been difficult for the NGO. The CEO and the president have had to take a loan against their own house to be able to maintain the NGO. And what's interesting for us is that a couple of months earlier, you probably have heard of the Colonial Pipeline case, which basically led the attackers to make out with about $2 million. So a similar amount of money. In one case, you had a small NGO, FBI couldn't really help that much, policing Hong Kong either, and the money is pretty much gone. There's not so much support that could be provided to them, and not much risk taken by the attackers. On the other side, you had Biden and Putin meet over this in Geneva. You had the FBI all over the case, and the amount of money stolen was pretty similar. So this made a thing that actually, an NGO like Roots of Peace, and I see many NGOs here that provide critical services to people in a similar way that at the end of the day, Colonial Pipeline provided a critical service in the US. It's just that in emerging economies, oftentimes critical services are provided by NGOs, yet they're not protected as well as critical service companies, operators in the Western world. And that we think is very contradictory with the vision of cyber peace we have, which needs to start with the most vulnerable. So we've started to basically do a lot more work helping NGOs, in particular humanitarian NGOs, improve their cybersecurity. And we've gone to realize that actually there's a lot of interesting things for attackers in that sector, right? There's obviously money. Humanitarian sector represents about $30 billion raised annually. The entire NGO economy, I think, is around $1 trillion. So that's a lot of money. That's of interest to criminals, but there's also data that's of interest to governments, and criminals can monetize that data, selling it later to governments. So unfortunately, there's a high interest and very low defenses, right? I think it's only 1 in 10 NGO that trains their staff around cybersecurity. Only 1 in 4 that monitors the network. Only 1 in 5 that has any kind of cybersecurity plan. So there's a lot of awareness that needs to be built, a lot of capabilities to how you're talking about earlier that needs to be provided. And that's why we've developed a program called the Cyber Peace Builders, which is essentially a corporate volunteering program. So we take experts, cybersecurity experts from the private sector, we ask them to volunteer about 40 hours a year, that's 5 days a year, to go and provide free help to NGOs that provide humanitarian services. We've launched that a couple of months ago, and it's readily available. So if there's interest in your NGO to start, kickstart the discussion of around cybersecurity. So how you're mentioning that necessity to start having these discussions, because many NGOs are just not aware that they may even be a threat. Cyber Peace Builders really are there for that. And just maybe a word around how that fits into our vision for cyber peace. We think that by basically helping those organizations that are at the forefront of providing critical services to vulnerable communities, we're going to be able to redefine a little bit general cybersecurity narrative that you read about, particularly in the West, that revolves around technology, around governance, around espionage, around big corporations, and actually start talking a lot more about what matters in cyberspace, and that is people. So when we're able to draw a bigger connection between people and cyber attacks, we think that we have a chance at basically influencing decision makers in the corporate world, but also in the public sector. That's why Cyber PC Institute is based in Geneva, also to be close to the UN and the GG process, etc. And we think that that narrative is very powerful. We don't talk enough about the human cost of cyber attack. And just last week, I think, if you read the news, you saw that there is unfortunately a baby that lost its life during a ransomware attack in the US. So that seems to be the first actual case. There were some previous warnings in the past month, but that seems to be the very first case of an actual death due to a cyber attack, and we really don't want to see that trend worsening. So that's our vision for cyber peace, and hopefully we can work together to build it together. Thanks.
Thanks, Adrian. I think what I'm hearing from both you and Suha is the need to take a much broader approach, but also to look very much at the people aspects and not just the kind of technology and technological aspects. Anthony, I'd like to come to you next as one of those organisations that has looked at this and invested in kind of response plans on cybersecurity. Could you share some of your experiences, please? Thank you.
Sure. So I'm Anthony Waddle. I'm the Controller of Governance and Assurance at SiteSavers. So I manage the compliance, governance, IT infrastructure and information security teams. So I've been through various instances, exercises and projects inside and outside the organisation relating to specifically data protection, but also cybersecurity. So what I'm aiming to do is give you kind of the operations perspective within a sector organisation. I hope that one of the takeaways is that you'll have the confidence to engage in a fairly technical topic. For you as the audience, cybersecurity is going to impact each of you and the way that you work and drive change. So looking at one of the questions of this debate, which is, are CSOs doing enough to secure their operations and safeguard the data of the groups we support? I think it'd be very unfair to say no, but we can reframe it and say that, yeah, more can be done and we can certainly catch up fast. So looking at CSOs, which is important, they're lean, we're creative and very specialized. However, with that specialization and focus means that some of the technical security skills are rare, or those who have them have multiple other responsibilities. And the financial burden of technology and lack of funding means that many of the services that we rely on are typically outsourced. So where's the risk? Well, the risk to those whose data we hold is becoming increasingly evident, and Suha spoke to that. It's important to look at the risk to the CSO. In some cases, this could be an existential risk. Third parties, we're relying more and more on outsourced services, which are often the only viable way to manage data collection, payroll, staff messaging, but it raises the surface area of the organization and makes us more reliant on the security and controls of others. SiteSavers itself was a victim, along with many other organizations, to the Blackboard CRM data breach last year. We chose a reputable vendor. We performed our due diligence. We had the correct processes in place, but it didn't stop us from being impacted. Now, business interruption, even the most minor cybersecurity breach, even one that you're not responsible for, can cause significant disruption to business operation and a huge amount of pressure on staff and stress. Treasury processes, payroll, core systems may all be suspended during an investigation, and those systems and processes and the data that sits behind them might be completely offline for weeks or months, and you might have to rebuild it from scratch if that's at all possible. Financial loss is probably the most obvious of the risks, but cyber crime perpetuated theft is at an all-time high against CSOs. Social engineering attacks exploiting our now predominantly digital environment and financial processes are becoming all too common. Donor confidence for those of us who receive public support, the threat of data being lost may be a factor in their giving decisions, and likewise institutional donors, their confidence can be rocked as a CSO undergoes the arduous task of investigation of their internal controls and processes post cyber incident. What can be done? Well, first off, don't panic. Well, maybe panic a bit, but the core activities are pretty light on expenditure. and can leverage those skills that we already have in the sector. So as addressing the risk, part of it involves reducing the impact of an incident. And this can be done through good data governance. So those of us who've been through GDPR will be familiar with some of these questions. Do we have the right data for the purpose we need it for? Are we holding too much? Are we sharing it with people we trust? And have we considered the security, location, retention period of the data in those shared locations? User access control. Only those who need access to this systems and data should have access. So taking a non-sector organization example, so in the private sector, a marketing intern was given access to all of the organization's core systems when they were onboarded, which was standard, happened for everyone. They included the organization's fund management system. The employee's password, which was password 1234, was guessed by a bad actor, and they used that to transfer funds outside of the organization. But there is support. So as Adrians mentioned, the Cyber Peace Institute, they're doing amazing work to address the risks and support the sector, but more can be done. There's free resources out there that are designed for the commercial sector, but cover the essentials of cybersecurity that we can leverage. So large projects can be extremely costly, but there's a lot of low-hanging fruit us as a sector can capitalize on and bring us up to speed. In the UK, there's the Cyber Essentials Scheme, which is a government scheme which addresses the basics of cybersecurity. And the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK publishes guidance that's highly effective against most of the low-level threats that we'll be facing. But don't be afraid to engage. Don't let the technical details be a barrier for entry for your engagement. You don't have to have a deep technical literacy to take action and manage these risks. Now, I'll leave you with just a couple of questions to ask yourself. In your context and where you work, think, what are your two most valuable data assets? And can you answer the following two questions for yourself? Do you know where that data is and how many copies there are of it and where those copies are? And do you know who has access and how to control that access? So thank you.
Thanks, Anthony. That's great. So some questions for people to ask themselves, but also I think very much your message is that there are avenues, and it's while people should be aware of the level of risk, they should also look for support that is out there and not feel that they have to do it on their own. So I'd like to invite Suha and Adrian back. Great. So now we've got the opportunity for you to ask questions to each other based on the inputs that you've heard. So I'll just do a quick round to see what questions you'd like to ask, and then we'll come to each of you in turn to answer. So Suha, did you have any questions for either Anthony or Adrian based on their inputs?
I do have a question that that emerged, I think, with Adrian. As he mentioned, Cyber Peace Institute works really closely with nonprofits, and I'm curious what the spectrum of engagement looks like based on sort of where that NGO or nonprofit is, in their sort of data journeys. And it's been a question that we've been exploring, how to sort of start talking about this early enough before you sort of digitize your processes as well. So just curious about what that engagement looks like and how it differs.
Thanks, Suha. So Adrian, hold that question in your head to answer later, and then can you ask your questions to either Suha or Anthony, please?
Yeah, I had actually a question for Anthony. Thanks a lot for your question, Suha, by the way. Anthony, I wonder if you could speak about the challenges that you've encountered implementing security controls in an NGO. If you could speak a little bit to that, would be great. Thanks.
Very concise, thank you. And Anthony, what you'd like to know, please.
Yes, I actually had two questions. Open it up for either. So the first one, with the sort of rise of sort of high-profile cyber attacks and kind of the increasing awareness in the population of the power of data, we're seeing a kind of a change in the trust in the communities where we work when it comes to sharing data with us. And then my second question is kind of looking at the pandemic and at a technical side, have we seen a shift in the landscape of the threats that we've faced as CSOs?
Great, thanks, Anthony. So Suha, could you perhaps speak to Anthony's question around trust in communities, please?
So I think I can speak from the Indian context, and the context I'm speaking from as well is that we ran a privacy campaign, and it was one of India's sort of like first consumer focused privacy campaigns. And we were really trying to understand sort of what the shift in attitudes were, especially after sort of, large documentaries like Netflix's Social Dilemma came out. when we saw this sort of change in fear around what these data breaches could look like at an individual level. And I think quite honestly, at a community level, there's still quite a sort of high mistrust around larger platforms, but I think there is a sense that, if my data is out there, there's nothing I can do about it. So there's a sense of powerlessness and a sense of sort of, lack of control over what can be done at this point in time. I think at a community level, and this varies, of course, with who we're speaking about, I still think there isn't necessarily a lot of transparency around what data is being captured, when and how. So I think although there are high profile data breaches and incidents like this that we're starting to hear about, there can be a lot more transparency. And so I do think trust isn't necessarily broken as a result of this. I think there is still a lot of passive data collection that happens to all of us and we're sort of caught unaware. So I would say that, while there is a greater sense of attention around these high profile cases, there isn't a sort of personal connect to say that this might happen to me. And a big part of our learning with the privacy campaign is to just start to narrativize these conversations a little bit, to indicate to communities or to individuals that, this breach didn't just happen to a big company, this could happen to you and your data as well. And so making that connect and sort of narrativizing that in the context of what that could mean in your life was, a big part of our learning. And we realized that it actually didn't decrease trust as much as we thought it could.
Thanks, Suha. And I think that kind of goes back to some of your questions as well around engagement. So Adrian, could you take that question about how to engage and how early to engage organisations? And also please, Anthony's question around the changing landscape during the pandemic, the changing threat landscape. Thank you very much.
Okay, in terms of the services that we provide through the Cyberpeace Builders and the maturity level of organizations that we help, it's a wide range on both cases. So both accounts. For the Cyberpeace Builders, we provide services before incidents. So we try and raise awareness. We try and help NGOs develop the right plans. We try and help them conduct tabletop exercises. The builders can even offer vulnerability scans all the way up to penetration tests. So there's really this idea of raising awareness amongst the staff and the leadership that cybersecurity is a real threat that they need to be on top of. We also offer a range of services post-incident. So if they have been hit, they have managed the incident, and they're trying to recover, they're trying to have their network, they're trying to investigate the case, understand what happened, maybe liaise with the police authorities. That is something we can offer support for too. We can even, sometimes notify them that they've been attacked, because we get a lot of data through our partners, and sometimes NGOs, as I mentioned, I think 3 out of 4 don't monitor their networks. They may not even know that some of their infrastructure, for instance, is being used in an attack or is being targeted, and so we can even let them know that that is the case. For instance, around the summer, we provided some support around spyware detection, right? And then we also provide the builders, the volunteers also provide non-technical supports around things like insurance discussions or legal discussions or coaching to the leadership, for instance, or even like communication stuff. Like if you want to put out a poster in the corridors of your NGO to raise awareness on cybersecurity, then we can bring in professionals that have a background in design, that work in a cybersecurity company or InfoSec office in a large corporation, and can dedicate some of their time to help you do that. The one thing that we don't do is incident response, right? Because this requires a timely answer, and it's not really compatible with a volunteering model. And so in terms of NGOs and the maturity level and the moment in which we reach them during their journey is quite large too. Suha, we have organizations that invest, that have their IT budget is like 1% of their entire budget, and cybersecurity is a chunk of that. And so they're really low level in terms of cybersecurity maturity. And those are the type of organizations that will ask us, hey, can I have 10 cybersecurity builders for the next 3 years? And that's when we explain to them that this program is there to help them kickstart their journey on cybersecurity. It's not there so that they can outsource their cybersecurity to a free service. How this should work, right? But it's great to have this initial conversation with them, so that we can really help them pave their way, prioritize their investments as well, so they don't waste money on useless things. And then we also meet up with actually like bigger organizations that are quite mature, but that have more specific needs, right? And so they're very thankful for the opportunity to be able to talk to a very particular expert in something and to assess something a little bit more precise. For instance, we had one that told us, you know what, we purchased like this insurance package, cyber insurance. So, you know, when you're at the stage of like looking into cyber insurances, it shows that you're already somewhere in your cybersecurity journey, right? And they were not really sure if what they had in mind was going to be covered, and they were not really sure if they were going to be able to get the right answers from the insurance. So they wanted to have like a second opinion. So we can provide that help through the cyber peace builders. Okay, I hope that answers your question, Suha. Yeah. Okay. Cool. And then Anthony, So we have seen a shift in the threat landscape for sure. I think the professionalization of attackers recently during the pandemic has been quite difficult. I don't like to buy into, you know, scare tactics and scare everyone off, and it's been like the usual, you know, strategy in cyber, like tell everyone it's going to be doomsday and then everything is worse than it was yesterday. But we have seen more sophistication in the tools they use. We have seen the use of attacks that are called supply chain attacks. Basically, you go through a technology provider and you attack through that channel. So, you know, you leverage the trust that an organization puts in their technology providers to get into the end target, which makes it very, very difficult as an organization to protect yourself. And I think often you have some great examples you can maybe elaborate on later on, you know, how you implement security controls and you control the entire perimeter of your organization. That's quite, you know, wide when you work with so many partners. And we've also seen a big surge in ransomware attacks, even against NGOs, particularly around what's called triple extortion ransomware attacks. So, you know, ransomware attacks are actually quite old. And in the past, they would just be like trying to block your files and ask for a ransom. And if you didn't pay, that was kind of it. You know, you would be left with your encrypted files and you had to rebuild your system. And what we've seen in the pandemic is this wave of triple extortion attacks. So attackers will first hit a target, whether it's a hospital or an NGO, and ask for a ransom to be paid, generally with a high figure. In case of Colonial Pipeline, was about, I think, $5 million. And then if the organization doesn't pay, they're going to go and start leaking files that they have stolen in the process and start asking for money to be paid. If not, you know, files are going to be leaked and you're going to be fined, etc., etc. So better pay us. And if that doesn't work, then they go after the data owners. In the case of hospitals, they go after patients. For instance, there was a case in Finland, a vast number of psychiatric hospital, the attackers actually leaked patient files and asked the patients to pay a couple of $100. So obviously the ransom goes down when you go from organizational to individual level. But this is the type of scenario that we're also seeing play out in the non-profit sector, which is something that was kind of, I don't want to say like criminals have ethics or anything, but in the past decade, it felt like criminals were kind of staying off of non-profits and hospitals and things that had to do with, you know, like human life. And unfortunately, like we don't see that like being maintained. So there's a number of groups that are now targeting these organizations. And I think it has to do with the fact that a lot of these weapons, basically cyber weapons, are being marketed. You know, you can basically rent them out. So if you had bad intentions in the past, but you don't have good capabilities, you're going to do anything. But right now, you have bad intentions and you don't have good capabilities, you can rent them out, and then you can attack hospitals and NGOs that are, you know, helping children in the field. Like those are the type of attack like we've seen. Like I think it was 2 weeks ago, there was a case of that came to us where like the attackers were basically negotiating with an NGO and telling them, "Oh, you're an NGO, that's great. We're going to give you a discount. Like you're going to get a discounted ransom." It's like, but this is awful. Like these guys know that they're attacking. At the end of the day, the beneficiaries are, you know, children or impoverished like populations, and the best you can come up with is discount. Like just like, yeah. Anyway, yeah. Long answer. Hope that was useful. Thanks.
Thank you. And Anthony, there was a question from Adrian to you on any challenges that you've had in implementing security controls that you can share, please. Thank
Sure.
you.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian, for the answer. It was quite helpful. So, I mean, we're very fortunate. We've got a very sort of astute and sort of engaged senior management team. So we haven't had to face some of the kind of challenges that other organizations might in sort of advocating for security internally. But I mean, as a CSO, you have to remain dynamic and responsive, and that's kind of at conflicts with enforced controls. So it's always down to the people. The people are the ones that allow you to remain secure. They're the ones that can cause a breach ultimately. So as you have quite a flexible workforce and flexible programs and development, you have to actually put a lot of work into the awareness and maintaining awareness. So it's actually a constant challenge of just keeping that level of awareness up, and it takes a lot of planning. And for example, we have phishing awareness campaigns that go out on a regular basis, because you just have to constantly keep at it, because unlike in the commercial sector where you can just turn things off everywhere and restrict what employees can do, and people are very focused on what their role is, we have to remain sort of open and dynamic. So we take a bit of the burden of that and trying to keep the awareness up. Now, the other part is sort of adapting what would traditionally be sort of financial controls to account for the fact that we're all home working, we're all distance working, and things are predominantly online. So if you think about how would an employee change their bank details for payroll, you know, that has to change because of cybersecurity and the increasing threat. And it's keeping ahead of that and changing it without having to learn from a breach. So the last thing you want to do is learn from your mistakes. So one of the challenges is kind of like the horizon scanning of what the possible changes are that we need to make to existing controls to kind of future-proof them against this new cyber environment.
Thanks, Anthony. We've got about 10 or 12 minutes for questions from the audience, so we'd really like to hear from you. So please do think if there's any thoughts or questions or even experiences which you'd like to share with the panelists, please do pop them in the chat and we can ask them. I just, while people are posting, I want to come back to a point that we were discussing earlier around some of the asymmetries. So I think one of the aspects we were thinking about were the asymmetries between the kind of sophistication of the attacks and the attackers and the level of vulnerability of organizations. And there was also a question about whether there are internal asymmetries in some civil society organizations between data around kind of financial data around supporters, and the way data of people who work with and are affected by our programs as well. So whether we have the same levels of control and security across our organizational data sets. So I'd just like to invite some thoughts from any of you on either of those aspects. Suha, just your thoughts on those, please.
Yeah, I'd be happy to take a stab at that. So I think in conversations we've had with a lot of nonprofits, there's been quite a demand from particularly donors to sort of have accountability over data practices and ensure that these organizations remain compliant. And so I think, you know, questions around having a privacy policy up on your website, and making sure that, you know, you have a cookie pop-up or something to that effect. That's definitely something that we're seeing, especially larger nonprofits kind of engaging in these conversations. I think a lot of the work we do at APTI is looking at sort of pushing the envelope of data governance and looking at concepts of data stewardship, where you really look at the beneficiaries of the data. So if there's data collected on, for example, migrant workers or farmers that belong to a particular NGO, how do you make sure their data rights are protected if they're sitting here in India and the nonprofit is based in the UK, for instance? And India may not have a data protection rule, data protection law at this point to protect that farmer's data. So I think there has been a heavier focus on, I think, protecting perhaps donor data for compliance reasons primarily. And I think there is scope for nonprofits to start to think about this with their beneficiaries and have these conversations in tandem. And it would shift the kind of conversation away from fear of, you know, cyber attacks and breaches to start thinking about, you know, what is the value of data and how can we start to sort of employ it in ways that, the users themselves who are, you know, part of this NGO or who are benefiting from the services of the NGO, from civil society organization, can also have a say in sort of what data is collected on them, what it's being used for, and shape some of these governance protocols that Anthony was also, you know, referring to when he started as well. So I think it kind of shifts the power dynamic a little bit. And I think that's the conversations we should be having is, if you are a farmer and your data is being collected, what is the data being collected for? Do you have a say in that context as well? Is it being shared with a financial institution? Can it impact your ability to get a loan later down the line? And can you as a nonprofit start to have these conversations with that farmer, with that migrant worker? And I think it becomes all the more critical to have these conversations with the people that the data can reflect important realities and decisions for. And one of the learnings for us, and I see one of the attendees is from this organization, we've been doing a lot of work around environmental data, and a lot of this data can be non-personal, and so we think it may not have the same risks attached to it, but it can still have tangible impacts on the life and livelihood of a lot of communities, particularly indigenous communities. And so we were speaking to an organization called the Open Development Initiative that operates also in a lot of Southeast Asia, and part of what we learned is that cybersecurity attacks can look so different for different communities, and they are actually quite well versed in understanding what those attacks and risks can look like at an individual level. And one of the learnings we were able to glean from this conversation is that, and oftentimes I think we look at interventions from a top-down level, so how institutions can protect their emails or their databases, or how to make certain technical choices. But in this context, it was really understanding from this nonprofit that this particular indigenous community didn't even want their data online. So how can you make sure that the data collected on them or on this particular community is something that can be maybe stored on a hard drive if they think that that's a safer way of securing their data, and that's something that they don't choose to share? How can that be reflected in the organization's policies and protocol around not just what technical safeguards are employed, but also starting to think about this sort of before even before thinking about attacks that can be mounted or malicious actors. So I think that's just that's maybe a quick input into sort of how we can change the narrative a little bit and think about the beneficiaries of the data, and start to involve them in these conversations.
Thanks. And Anthony, I think you had some quick thoughts on the asymmetry questions, please.
Yeah, I mean, there's inherently going to be an asymmetry when you have, things like GDPR, which enforce you to sort of enact these data rights for individuals. But then also, I mean, you do have research standards that do guide how data for sort of particularly project work is handled. And that's typically like data anonymization. But what we're seeing now is increasing numbers of national data protection laws that are modeled on GDPR coming out. So there's a new data protection bill in India that's been proposed, which does increase these controls. So I think what we're going to see is, if an organization doesn't already address that asymmetry internally, it's going to be enforced through national laws and legislation.
Thanks. Now, we had a question around the recent attack on Twitch, but I'd like to broaden that out a bit. So rather than talk about specific cases, but perhaps, Adrian, just what you see in terms of these high-profile attacks that do kind of shake confidence and trust of people in organizations. Do you want to kind of reflect on that, either in a wider context or for CSOs and the organizations that you work with?
Yeah, certainly. So I'm not particularly familiar with the case, the Twitch case, but what I can say though is that trust that civil society organizations have spent decades creating on the ground is trust that needs to be transferred now online, and they're increasingly engaging with the beneficiaries through online means. And so the type of attacks that you see reported in the news regularly, like the Twitch case, affect the general trust that people have in online technologies. And so it is perhaps even more difficult for NGOs that have very particular and very, there's a high need for trust when you engage with vulnerable communities, you manage very sensitive data. You think of NGOs, for instance, operating in conflict zones or working directly with beneficiaries that are themselves very vulnerable, then the need for trust is even higher. And that's definitely something we see in our activities around the Cyber Peace Builders, where it's just not possible to have a volunteer from the United States working with an NGO in Kenya and just hoping that I will work. So we have actually regional advisors, the people that can really make that kind of trust connection to really help out there. So something that we see increasingly through disinformation campaigns. We talked a little bit before about the pandemic and the threat landscape changing, and there's been a lot of disinformation going on around vaccine research, around things happening around the virus itself, and that has created a climate of general digital distrust. And we've talked a lot in the past decade about digital trust. I think it's probably time we start talking about digital distrust and what are the different measures that everyone's taking or not taking that are actually fueling digital distrust. And so if we're able to be conscious of everything that we're doing, even as individuals, taking the conversation slightly away now CSOs and looking at everyone's role online. When we share each other, WhatsApp messages that contain information we're not really sure is valid, then we're actually fueling that type of digital distrust and actually harming cyber peace overall.
Thanks, Adrian. I think we're kind of out of time now for more questions, and we need to wrap up. But I would like to give you the chance to have final, very quick inputs on calls to action for civil society, or anything that you see as the main takeaways from this conversation for our audiences. So we'll have a quick once round. So Suha, please, final thoughts.
Yeah, so I want to reiterate that I think when you come to conversations around cybersecurity, it invokes a lot of fear around what could potentially happen. And I think as much as we need to be preparing for that, I think at the same time, we need to consider, shifting the conversation, like I said, and exploring avenues to kind of increase the participation around questions of data and informational security with the people that it could actually impact. And so considering them as the center of your interventions around cybersecurity, I think is really important. And I think the steps that civil society organizations can take, I think it's really about having these conversations also around capacity and capability and exploring not only what you can do technically, but starting to have conversations around data and data rights and understanding that your beneficiaries do have rights around this data to start with. And also ensuring that you as a civil society actor are not sort of implementing the same actions of sort of over extracting data from your beneficiaries. So how can you look at minimizing the risk and harm at an earlier stage rather than a later stage? And then I think that the larger sort of takeaway for us is not just to focus on civil society organizations, but like I said, at an ecosystem level, for organizations to be able to take on this work and ensure that these rights are protected, how do we consider, allocating significant funds for nonprofits who are starting to, take this journey on? Because as much as regulation can help articulate those rights and put in focus what needs to be done, I think at the stage of implementation, a lot of nonprofits are still struggling, right? And I think Adrian's organization is doing really great work in being able to, help these organizations identify different mechanisms to start to put that in place. But I think for the most part, we need to consider just, as an ecosystem as well, how we can start directing support to nonprofits and civil society organizations. And like I said, having more conversations about the value of data and ways in which communities can access the value of data, as opposed to portraying it as a high profile risk to start with. And I think that can set the foundation for sort of greater resilience around data, and then we can move to conversations around protection and privacy. But I think if we start from the point of breach, like malicious attacks and breaches and risks like this, we've gone too far. So I really think we need to set the foundation early on enough, and that's the reason I asked Adrian a little bit about when we start to have these conversations with nonprofits and CSOs, and can we do it earlier rather than later in the game. So that's what I'll leave you guys with, and yeah, thank you for having me.
Thanks, Suha. And Adrian, Anthony, very last quick inputs from you, please.
I'll just echo what Suha said. I think having this conversation, trying to bring in more transparency, trying to speak up, trying to share, what are the challenges, the difficulties that everyone's encountering in the civil society sector will help for solutions to emerge and for ecosystems to really be built around those challenges. So that's what we're trying to do, and we're more than happy to continue having these conversations in different formats. So thanks a lot for having me as well.
My final thoughts. So unlike the commercial sector, where kind of the goals of an organization are at odds with another, we are a society and we are there to help each other. So, I mean, we've supported other organizations that have been through incidences, and we're here to continue doing that. There's some great networks for heads of internal audit, safeguarding physical security and IT in the UK and globally, and I think we're primed for another one for cybersecurity. And if anyone wants to reach out and seek support, like Adrian mentioned, Cyber Peace Institute, but also we're here as well. I don't know if Vicky, you can pass on people's communications, but we're all here as a society to help each other.
Thanks, Anthony. And thank you to all three of you for your thoughtful contributions today, and our audience for joining us. There are further resources from our panelist organisations in the background reading on the digital debates pages of the Centre's website and the show notes, or you can indeed get in touch with our contributors via the team here at the Centre. So please do get in touch if you have any follow-up questions. questions. Our past 6 debates are now available on both the Centre's YouTube and podcast channels, so please also go and check those out. And we will next be back in November to debate civil society organisations joining the public discourse on machine learning and artificial intelligence. So please look out for details on how to engage with our content from that debate. Thank you everyone again for joining, and we look forward to continuing these really interesting and important conversations in our organisations and our sector post-debate. Thanks again, everyone.